Welcome back, U.S. history students. Hope everyone had a nice weekend. Before we get into our work today, just a couple of announcements, all right? So the assignment today, as you can see on our PowerPoint, is Monday, April 20th. The second marking period wraps up April 29th. So we have about a week and a half left to get assignments completed. I sent this out in messages to parents, but if you're falling behind, one of the areas you can really focus on to make up some points in your average is making sure that all those exams are completed. We've had a couple writing assessments, we've had a couple multiple choice, so it's a great place to start. Also, another change, you'll see that the assignments being given to you on April 20th, which is a Monday. This assignment is going to be due Tuesday at 11:59 p.m. So we're going to be stretching out the time frame for completing your assignments a little bit moving forward. Okay, so we'll be getting into our assignment for today. So for our aim, it says, how can we use source material to identify similarities and differences between the Korean and Vietnam War? So we're still focusing on our Cold War unit, and we're going to be looking at two of the kind of more famous wars within the Cold War. All right, so we're starting off with the Korean War, then we're going to shift to the Vietnam War. And we're trying to identify what's similar about these two wars and what is different. All right, they're both occurring within the Cold War, so we do see some overlap, but at the same time, there are going to be some differences. Okay, on your paper, you have the do now printed, but we're just trying to summarize what that foreign policy of containment was. Reminder, go to the root of the word if you need some help in remembering what this was. The second part of the question, why does the U.S. have this policy during the Cold War? Okay, so summarize, then make that connection to the content. All right, you can pause the video so you can do the do now, and then we will pick up with our fast facts. All right, so bullet one of our fast facts. It says in the late 1940s, a civil war broke out in Korea as the South developed an anti-communist democratic government, while the North became communist. So one really important thing to remember about the Korean War is it starts as a civil war. All right, there's two factions within the country. The South develops this democratic government. The North develops as a communist government, and these two sides are fighting over the future of Korea. All right, one connection to what we've learned already, the U.S. had a civil war. All right, that's more focused on the issue of slavery, South versus North. So Korea has a similar situation break out in the late 1940s. One major difference is that the U.S. gets involved in this civil war because of their policy of containment. All right, we talked about containment. We talked about why the U.S. takes this foreign policy during Cold War. They start to utilize that foreign policy specifically when this civil war breaks out. The U.S. is trying to contain the spread of communism. If the northern portion of Korea is successful in this civil war and they turn the whole Korean country into a communist government, that's growing the influence of communism in the world. That goes against the U.S.'s policy of containment. So we see that the U.S. comes into this civil war and they back the South Korean military forces. One of the major takeaways from this, and you'll get this in the text as well, is a modern connection. All right, the Korean War never resolves itself with a clear victor and a clear loser. All right, North Korea nowadays is still a communist nation. South Korea nowadays is still a democratic capitalist nation. The U.S. and South Korea have very close alliance still to this day. Okay, so that's kind of how this war wraps up. Bullet 3, now we're going to be shifting to the Vietnam War. Okay, so the main cause of the Vietnam War is very similar to what's happening in Korea. We see that the North is trying to become a communist-controlled government, and we see the South is more of a democratic, capitalist leaning society. So very similar to what happens in Korea, we see in Vietnam as well. One of the major differences I do want to point out here is the time frame of Vietnam versus Korea. The Korean War is much shorter in comparison to the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War carries on for about 20 years. It's one of the longest wars the United States is a part of in American history. So we see that the U.S. gets involved in Vietnam as a result of this policy of containment as well. We also see this idea of what's called domino theory. And domino theory is what it sounds like. It's this fear that if you stack up all of these dominoes, the first one knocks over, all the other dominoes will fall. That's the rationale the U.S. has for stepping into Vietnam to stop the spread of communism. The fear is if Vietnam becomes a fully communist nation, that's the first domino that'll fall, and other countries in Asia will fall to communism as well. So this is the U.S.'s justification of getting involved in the Vietnam War. We see another major difference is that the Vietnam War ends with victory for the communists. The U.S. troops withdraw in 1973. We'll be going over why the U.S. Withdraws in 1973. There's a lot of opposition. There's a lot of protest. And the U.S. military really struggles to be successful in this war effort. About 2 years later, South Vietnam is completely taken over, and Vietnam becomes a unified communist nation. So in 1975, it's almost the U.S.'s worst fear. Containment has failed. This idea of the domino theory might be beginning, and Vietnam becomes a fully communist nation. So before we get into the activity, we'll look at this map. And this map is showing you a little bit of those similarities between the Korean War and the Vietnam War. So on the left-hand side here, we have the Korean War, and you see this divide where you have South Korea being supported by the United Nations, the United States, and then you have North Korea being supported by the Soviet Union and China as well. And this divide, this 38th parallel, is still that dividing line in Korea today. You don't have a unified Korea. On the right-hand side, we see, once again, Northern Vietnam, backed by the communist government, Southern Vietnam, backed by that democratic and capitalist government, is once again dividing this nation. Major difference, though, North Vietnam ends up being victorious, defeating the South Vietnamese and unifying this country under communism. Okay, so what you guys are going to be doing today is you have one text covering the Korean War. You have some analysis questions below. And then you have a secondary text focusing on the Vietnam War. So what's going to happen is you're going to look at these wars independently to start. And then your summary task is going to be bringing both of those wars together. So it's showing up as a table, but really try to think of the summary task more as a Venn diagram. All right, what are at least three differences about the Korean War? What are three unique factors for the Korean War? What are three unique factors for the Vietnam War? And then what is shared between these two wars? Okay, so use the text, use your fast facts, use those maps to try to come up with three differences for each war, and then three similarities, three things that are shared. Okay, so reminder, this assignment's being given to you on Monday. You have Tuesday to work on it as well. I'll be hosting a Google Meet office hour on Tuesday if you need some support on this activity. And if you're missing assignments, you have some extra time built into the week now to make those things up. All right, we've got a week and a half left in the marking period. Let's try to get rid of any zeros we have. Hope you guys are doing well. Speak with you soon.